The church was full. 300 people had come to say goodbye to my father. His colleagues from 30 years at the engineering firm. His poker buddies. His neighbors. His fishing partners. People whose names I barely knew but whose faces I recognized from the edges of my childhood. People who had watched me grow up and who were now watching me walk down the center aisle of St. Michael's in a black dress with my hands clasped in front of me, because if I didn't hold them together they would shake. I had been holding myself together for 4 days. Since the hospital called at 2 a.m. on a Thursday. Since I drove alone through dark streets because my husband Marcus hadn't answered his phone. Since I sat in a waiting room chair and a doctor whose face I will never forget told me that my father was gone. 4 days of arrangements. 4 days of phone calls and catering and flowers and a eulogy I had written in my kitchen at midnight, crying over my laptop while Marcus slept in the next room. 4 days of being strong because there was no one else to be strong. And now I was walking down the aisle of St. Michael's toward the front pew where my seat was waiting, the seat reserved for immediate family, for the daughter of the man in the casket at the front of the church, and I looked up and saw that someone was already sitting in it. I stopped walking. I stood in the middle of the aisle of my father's funeral with 300 people behind me, and I looked at the woman sitting in my seat. She was maybe 30. Dark hair, red lipstick, a fitted black dress that was inappropriate in a way I couldn't have articulated precisely but felt immediately. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead at the altar, as if she belonged there, as if she had every right to be in that pew, in that seat, at this funeral. I looked at Marcus. He was sitting one seat over from her. He looked up when he felt my eyes on him. For a single second, his face did something complicated, a flash of something that could have been panic, or guilt, or the specific expression of a man who has been caught doing something he cannot explain, and then he rearranged his features into something careful and neutral, and he said, very quietly, "Meg, sit down." I stood in the aisle for 3 more seconds. I want to tell you what I was feeling in those 3 seconds, but the honest answer is that I was not feeling anything yet. The feeling was coming. I could sense it behind me like a wave that hasn't reached shore. But in those 3 seconds, I was simply very still, very clear, and entirely certain of one thing. I walked to the front pew. I sat down next to her, and I leaned over and whispered something in her ear. She left crying. But I am getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how we got here first. My name is Megan Calloway. I am 38 years old. I teach high school English in Millbrook, Ohio. I have been teaching the same students to love books, or at least to tolerate them, for 12 years, and I am told I am good at it, which is the thing I am most proud of professionally. I have been married to Marcus Calloway for 9 years. Marcus is 42. He is a sales director for a medical supply company based in Columbus. He is handsome in a reliable, familiar way, dark eyes, broad shoulders, the kind of face that looks trustworthy at first glance and continues to look trustworthy for a considerable length of time after it has stopped being true. He is charming in social situations, good at remembering people's names, good at being the person at a party that everyone gravitates toward. People like Marcus immediately. I liked Marcus immediately. That was the problem. We met at a friend's wedding. He spilled his drink. I handed him napkins. We talked for 4 hours. It was the kind of beginning that feels like a sign. The kind that makes you think, this is the one. We dated for 2 years. We got married in a small ceremony in the garden of my parents' house in Millbrook, 20 feet from the maple tree my father had planted when I was born. My father walked me down a grass aisle in his best suit, and he was crying before we reached the end of it, and I was crying too, and Marcus was waiting at the front with an expression I believed, completely and without reservation, was love. I believed a lot of things about Marcus for a long time. My father loved him. That is the part that cuts the deepest now, looking back. My father, Robert Collier, 67 years old, 30 years at an engineering firm, poker buddies, fishing trips, a man who called me every Sunday afternoon without fail, thought Marcus was exactly the right person for his daughter. He said so more than once. "That man would do anything for you, Meggie," he told me once, about 5 years into the marriage. We were sitting on his back porch in the summer, watching fireflies. I smiled and said I knew. I did not know anything of the kind. But I believed it, which is different. The signs were there.
I want to be honest about that.
I am an English teacher. I spend my professional life teaching young people to read between the lines, to notice what is not said, to pay attention to the subtext beneath the surface of a story. I am, professionally, a person who catches things. I did not catch this. Or, rather, I caught pieces of it and put them away because looking at them directly was not something I was ready to do. Marcus started traveling more for work about 2 years ago. Columbus to Cincinnati, Cincinnati to Cleveland, Cleveland to Pittsburgh, a rotating series of regional sales territories that required his presence with increasing frequency. He explained it easily. A new district, a new quota, a new manager who wanted face time with clients. It all made sense. Everything he told me made sense. That is one of the things that makes a practiced liar very difficult to catch. The explanations are always plausible. They are designed to be. He started being slightly different when he came home from trips. Not dramatically different. Not in a way that demanded confrontation. Just slightly lighter, slightly more cheerful. The specific mood of someone who has recently been very happy and is carrying the residue of it. I noticed and told myself I was being paranoid. A happy husband was a good thing. A man who enjoyed his work was a good thing. I told myself a lot of things. About 6 months ago, I found a receipt. It was in the pocket of his blazer. I was taking things to the dry cleaner, a completely ordinary Tuesday errand, and I checked the pockets the way you do, automatically, without thinking, the way you have done 1,000 times in 9 years of marriage. The receipt was from a restaurant in Columbus. A nice one. A very nice one. The kind of restaurant that costs 3 times what we spend on a normal dinner out, the kind with a prix-fixe menu and a sommelier, and candles on every table. The receipt was for 2 people. The date was a Thursday, 2 months prior. A Thursday when Marcus had told me he was in Pittsburgh for a client dinner. I stood in the hallway with the dry cleaning over my arm and the receipt in my hand, and I looked at it for a long time. Then I put it back in the pocket. I took the blazer to the dry cleaner. I drove home. I made dinner. When Marcus came home from work, I asked him about his day and listened to his answer and did not say a single word about what I had found. I am not proud of that. Looking back, I understand why I did it, the same reason I had been putting pieces away for months, the same reason anyone delays looking at something they already know. Because once you look directly, you cannot look away again. But here is what I also did, starting that same evening. I started paying attention in a different way.
Her name was Danielle.
I found this out gradually, over the course of 6 weeks, by becoming a different kind of person than I had ever wanted to be. I looked at Marcus's phone when he left it on the counter. I noted the frequency of calls from a number labeled D, sales team. I found, on a Sunday afternoon when he was watching football, and I was in the bedroom with the door mostly closed, a text conversation that told me everything I had not wanted to know.
Danielle Marsh.
She was 31. She worked in the marketing department of one of Marcus's client companies in Columbus. The text conversation had been going on for 8 months. It was not ambiguous about its nature. I read enough to know the facts. I did not read all of it. I did not need to. I put the phone back on the counter. I went into the bathroom. I ran the tap, so he wouldn't hear anything, and I stood over the sink gripping the edge of it, and I breathed. 4 minutes. Then I washed my face. I went back to the living room. I sat on the other end of the couch and watched the second half of the football game and said exactly the right number of ordinary words at exactly the right moments. Marcus did not notice anything. That night, lying in the dark while he slept beside me, I made a decision. I was not going to confront him yet. Not until I knew what I wanted. Not until I had figured out what I was going to do next. I called my best friend Patrice the next morning. I need you to listen to me for a while, I said.
Always, she said.
I told her everything. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. Meg, she said carefully, what do you need from me right now? I need you to help me figure out what to do, I said. Because I know the truth. I just don't know what to do with it yet. Okay, she said. Then that's what we'll do. I spent 3 weeks in that in-between state. Knowing but not acting. Living in the ordinary surface of the marriage while underneath it, quietly, I was preparing. I contacted a divorce attorney. I pulled our financial records. I documented what I could. I made sure that my own accounts, the ones from before the marriage, were cleanly separated and protected. I am a careful person by nature. It is useful in an English classroom, and it turned out to be useful in this. And then, on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later, my phone rang at 2 a.m. and everything else stopped. My father had been in the hospital for a week. A cardiac event, the doctors called it. He was stable, then less stable, then stable again. I had been driving to Millbrook every other day to see him. Marcus had come once, briefly, on the first day. Since then, he had expressed concern from a distance, asking how Dad was doing, telling me to keep him updated, patting my shoulder in a way that was meant to be comforting and felt instead like something performed. On Thursday at 2 a.m. the hospital called, and I drove to Millbrook alone because Marcus didn't answer his phone. I sat in a waiting room for an hour, and then a doctor came out and told me my father was gone. I sat in that waiting room chair for a very long time after the doctor left. My father had called me every Sunday afternoon for 12 years. He had walked me down a grass aisle and cried before we reached the end of it. He had sat on his back porch with me in the summer and told me that Marcus would do anything for me.
He was wrong about that.
But he had believed it, and he had believed it because he loved me and wanted it to be true, and that is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. I drove home as the sun was coming up. Marcus was in the kitchen making coffee, fully dressed, keys on the counter. He had his phone in his hand when I walked in. "I tried to call you," I said. He put the phone down quickly. "I know. I'm so sorry. The ringer was off. I didn't." He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around me. "I'm so sorry about your dad." I let him hold me. I stood in his arms in the kitchen in the early morning light, and I let him hold me because I was grieving, and because grief makes you hold on to whatever is available, even when you know the thing you are holding on to is not what you thought it was. "There's a lot to arrange," I said when I stepped back. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I'll handle the arrangements," I said. "The funeral is Monday." "Of course," he said. "I'll be there." He said it with such ease. Such complete, uncomplicated ease. I looked at his face. "Good," I said. I handled everything. 4 days of phone calls. The funeral home, the church, the caterer, my father's friends and colleagues and poker partners, the neighbors, the distant relatives. 4 days of writing a eulogy between crying jags at the kitchen table. 4 days of driving back and forth to Millbrook to coordinate with my mother, who was devastated in a quiet, interior way that made her seem smaller than I had ever seen her. Marcus was present in the house during those 4 days. He was not unhelpful, exactly. He answered the door when things were delivered. He made sure there was food in the refrigerator. He told me to rest when I looked tired. He said, more than once, that my father was a wonderful man, and that he was so sorry. But twice during those 4 days, I saw him step outside to take phone calls. Long calls. And when he came back in, he had the specific expression of a man who is managing 2 separate realities and working hard to keep them from touching each other. I noticed. I put it away. I had a funeral to plan. On Sunday night, the night before the service, I sat at the kitchen table at midnight going over the final details, the program order, the timing of the reception, the flowers my mother had requested. Marcus came downstairs for water and found me there. "Come to bed," he said. "You need to sleep." "In a minute," I said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Meg, your dad would want you to take care of yourself." I looked up at him. He was backlit by the hallway light, his face in shadow. I thought about the receipt in the blazer pocket. I thought about the text messages. I thought about the phone calls he had taken in the backyard while I was planning my father's funeral. "I know," I said. "I'll be up soon." He went back to bed. I sat at the table for another hour. The morning of the funeral, Marcus was up before me. He was dressed by the time I came downstairs. Dark suit, dark tie. He looked appropriate. He always looked appropriate. We drove to St. Michael's together in near silence. I had my eulogy in my bag, folded in 3, the paper soft from how many times I had opened and refolded it. My hands were in my lap. The morning was overcast, the kind of flat gray sky that makes everything look slightly unreal. We arrived early. The funeral director met us at the door and escorted us to the staging area. My mother was already there, Small and composed in a black dress, her hair done carefully the way she always did it for important occasions. "Go ahead in," the funeral director said about 15 minutes before the service. "Family takes the front pew." Marcus said he needed to use the restroom. I walked with my mother toward the front of the church. That was when I saw her. I have described the moment already. The front pew. My seat. The woman sitting in it with her hands folded and her red lipstick and her fitted black dress. But I want to tell you what I understood in the 3 seconds I stood in the center aisle. I understood that she was there on purpose. Not accidentally. Not through some confusion about seating. She was there because Marcus had told her to come. He had told her the time and the location, and she had come, and she was sitting in the pew reserved for his wife because she had been told, or had chosen to believe, which amounts to the same thing, that she belonged there. That was the thing that went through me in those 3 seconds. Not the shock of seeing her. I already knew she existed. The shock of understanding that Marcus had brought her here. To my father's funeral. To the church where I was about to stand at a podium and tell 300 people about the man who had raised me. He had brought her here, and he had let her sit in my seat. I walked to the front pew. I sat down next to her. She turned slightly. Up close, she was younger than she had looked from a distance. Pretty, nervous, her hands now gripping each other in her lap. She did not know what to do with her face. I leaned over. I put my mouth close to her ear, and very quietly, very calmly, I said, "I know exactly who you are. And my husband's attorney will be hearing from my attorney on Tuesday. So think very carefully about whether you want to be in this building right now." I straightened up. She sat absolutely still for about 4 seconds. Then she stood up, gathered her bag, and walked quickly up the side aisle toward the back of the church. I did not watch her go. I reached into my own bag, took out my eulogy, and unfolded it on my lap. From one seat over, Marcus said, very quietly, in a voice scraped down to almost nothing, "Meg, don't," I said. Quiet, flat, absolute. He didn't. The organ began to play. I delivered my father's eulogy standing at the podium of St. Michael's Church with 300 people in the pews and my husband sitting in the front row and my father's casket 10 feet away from me. I want to tell you about that because it matters. I had been terrified of this moment for 4 days. I am a person who teaches literature for a living. I am comfortable with words on a page. I am significantly less comfortable standing at a microphone in front of a room full of people who are all feeling the same loss I am feeling, and I had been certain I would not make it through the eulogy without losing my composure entirely. I did not lose it. I don't know exactly where the steadiness came from. Maybe it was the thing that had happened in the pew. Maybe it was that whatever had been tightening in my chest for the past 6 months had, in those 4 seconds of whispering in a stranger's ear, released into something else. Something clear and cold and strangely grounding. I stood at that podium, and I talked about my father. I talked about Sunday phone calls. About the maple tree in the backyard of my parents' house, the one he planted when I was born, which was now taller than the house itself. About the way he had cried at my wedding before we reached the end of the aisle, and how he had tried to hide it and failed completely, and how I loved him most in that moment. I talked about a man who believed in showing up, who came to every school play, every graduation, every ordinary Saturday when his daughter just needed to be near someone solid, who called every Sunday not because it was scheduled, but because he wanted to. My voice shook once near the end. I stopped for a second. I looked at my mother in the front pew, her face wet and steady. I finished. 300 people applauded. Some of them were crying. I walked back to my seat, sat down next to Marcus, and put my eulogy back in my bag. He reached for my hand. I let him hold it for the length of the service because we were in public and my mother was beside me and my father was in a casket at the front of this church, and none of those things allowed for what was actually happening between Marcus and me to be visible to anyone in that room. Not yet. The reception was at my parents' house. The same house where we had gotten married. The backyard with the maple tree. 300 people moved through the rooms, eating the food I had ordered and telling stories about my father and occasionally finding me to say the things people say at these events, that he was a wonderful man, that he lived a good life, that he would be missed. I said thank you. I said I know. I refilled my coffee cup 4 times. Marcus stayed close. He played his role, the supportive husband, attentive, quiet, present. He got me a plate of food I didn't eat. He steered relatives toward me and steered others away when I looked overwhelmed. He was very good at this. He had always been very good at the public face of a good marriage. At one point in the afternoon, Patrice appeared at my elbow. She had driven 2 hours to be there, which is the kind of person Patrice is. She handed me a glass of water. She looked at my face. She said, very quietly, "Are you okay?" "No," I said, just as quietly. "But I will be." She held my gaze for a moment, nodded. "Do you need anything from me right now?" "Just keep being here," I said. "Always," she said. She stayed until the last guest left. After everyone was gone, and my mother had been settled with her sister who had come from Cleveland, Marcus and I drove home in silence. The silence on the drive there that morning had been the silence of grief, of two people in the presence of something too large for words. The silence on the way home was different. This was the silence of two people who both know exactly what is coming and are each waiting for the other to begin it. We walked into the house. Marcus set his keys on the counter. He loosened his tie. He turned to face me. "Meg." "Not tonight," I said. He stopped. "I buried my father today," I said. "Whatever this is," I gestured at the space between us. "It can wait until tomorrow. Tonight it waits." He looked at me for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated. Guilt, I thought. And possibly something else. Possibly something that looked like a kind of exhausted relief at the delay. "Okay," he said quietly. I went upstairs. I took off the black dress. I got into bed. I did not sleep for a long time, but eventually I did. And in the morning I woke up and lay still for a few minutes looking at the ceiling, and then I got up and went downstairs and made coffee. And when Marcus came down, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped around the mug, and I said,
"Sit down.
We need to talk." He sat. I did not say everything I knew immediately. I have learned, since then, that the way a conversation starts determines a great deal about where it ends. I did not want to begin with accusations that he could shape into denials. I wanted to begin with a single, specific, undeniable fact. "Danielle Marsh," I said. His face changed. Every muscle in it changed, all at once, the way a face does when it stops performing and becomes the real thing underneath. He opened his mouth. "Don't," I said. "Don't explain and don't deny. I know who she is. I know how long it has been. And I know you brought her to my father's funeral and put her in my seat." He closed his mouth. "I need to know one thing," I said. "Just one. Look me in the eyes and tell me, how long?" He was very still. Then he said, 8 months. I nodded. I already knew that from the text, but I needed to hear him say it. 8 months, I said. "Including when my father was in the hospital." He looked at the table. "Including when I was calling you from the waiting room at 2 in the morning and you didn't answer your phone," I said. He still didn't look up. "Marcus." My voice was very quiet, very steady. I had cried for 4 days about my father, and I was not going to cry about this. Not here. Not in front of him. "Look at me." He looked up. "I have spoken to an attorney," I said. "I have been documenting things for 3 weeks. The financial accounts are already protected. The divorce petition will be filed on Tuesday." I paused. "There is nothing you can say right now that changes any of that. I just wanted you to know that you are not telling me something I don't already know. And I wanted to say it to your face." He looked at me with the expression of a man who is calculating how bad something is and arriving at an answer he is not prepared for. "Meg," he finally said. His voice was rough. "I know there is nothing I can say. I know that. But I need you to know that I know you're sorry," I said. "I don't need to hear it. I need to say it." "Then say it to someone else," I said. "I am not the person you say it to." I stood up. I picked up my coffee. "You can stay here for now," I said. "One of us will need to find somewhere else to be by the end of the month. My attorney will be in touch with yours about the process." I walked upstairs. Behind me, Marcus said my name once more. I did not turn around. The weeks that followed were not simple. They are never simple. Anyone who tells you a divorce is a clean, decisive break has not been through one. It is paperwork and attorneys and the long, grinding business of separating a life that has been shared for 9 years into its component parts, what belongs to whom, what was built together, what came from where. Marcus moved into an apartment in early April. He took what was clearly his and left the rest, which was appropriate and also slightly heartbreaking in the particular way that appropriate things can be heartbreaking. The quiet of the house after he left was enormous. It was the quiet of a space that had been two people's for a long time and was now one person's again. I sat in that quiet for a while, learning what it sounded like. My attorney's name was Paula Hendricks. She was 50, efficient, and possessed of the specific calm authority that comes from having navigated a great many people through the worst practical experience of their adult lives. She made the process as clean as it could be given the circumstances. The financial picture is fairly straightforward, she told me in our second meeting. No children, joint assets that are clearly documented, premarital accounts that are protected. She paused. You said you'd begun separating your accounts 3 weeks before you initiated the conversation with your husband? Yes, I said. She nodded in a way that communicated approval without saying it directly. That was smart. It means we're not starting from a position of vulnerability. I had time to prepare, I said. You did, she said. Not everyone does. I want to tell you about something that happened in May. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon, the time she had always called, the time my father had always called, the time that still made my chest tighten when my phone rang because for a half second, every single week, some part of me still expected his voice. Maggie, she said. How are you? I'm okay, I said. How are you?
Better, she said.
I went to the garden today. The maple tree is doing something. What do you mean?
Blooming, she said.
Your father always said that tree had a schedule of its own. I went out this morning and the whole thing was covered in seeds. Those little helicopter seeds. They were everywhere. All over the yard. I sat down on the back step of my own house, phone pressed to my ear, looking at the yard. He planted that tree when you were born, she said. I know, I said. He told me that story many times. He was so happy that day, she said. He said, and I remember this exactly, he said, a girl needs a tree. Something that will still be here when I'm gone. I pressed my free hand against my face. Mom, I said, when I could speak again. I know, she said. I know. We stayed on the phone for an hour. We talked about my father and the maple tree, and eventually about other things, ordinary things, the texture of continuing to live when someone who has been at the center of your life is no longer there. She told me about her sister coming to visit. I told her about work, about a student who had written an essay about a novel I had taught for 12 years, and somehow found something in it I had never noticed. When we hung up, I sat on the back step for a while in the May evening. My father had believed Marcus was exactly right for his daughter.
He had been wrong about that.
But he had believed it because he was a man who trusted the people his daughter loved, and that is not a flaw. That is a quality. The flaw was not my father's. The flaw was not mine. I sat on the step until the light went. Then I went inside and made dinner for one person, and I ate it at my kitchen table, and I did not feel sorry for myself, which I considered a small but real accomplishment. The divorce was finalized in June. There was no dramatic courtroom conclusion. There was a signed agreement, a judge's signature, a last meeting in Paula's office where she handed me a set of documents in a folder and told me it was done. I thanked her. I shook her hand. I walked out into a Thursday afternoon in June with a folder under my arm and the specific lightness of something that has been heavy for a long time being set down. I drove to my parents' house. My mother was in the garden. She saw me pull up and came to the gate. She looked at my face and said, "Is it done?" "It's done," I said. She put her arms around me. She held on for a long moment. I let myself be held, the way you can with your mother in a way you can't always allow yourself elsewhere, without having to be fine, without having to reassure anyone, just entirely as you are. "Your father would be so proud of you," she said. I pulled back and looked at her. "For getting divorced?" "For handling it the way you did," she said. "With your head, with your spine." I laughed. It was real and sudden and slightly wet at the edges. "Come see the tree," she said. We walked to the back of the garden. The maple tree was full, enormous, casting a wide shadow across the yard. The helicopter seeds had long since blown away. Now it was just leaves, deep green, the tree that my father had planted the day I was born because he said a girl needs something that will still be here when he's gone. He was right. It was still here. There are things people ask me about when they hear the story. They ask about the moment in the church. The whisper. They want to know exactly what I said and how she reacted and whether I feel guilty about it. I do not feel guilty about it. Here is what I said. I know exactly who you are. And my husband's attorney will be hearing from my attorney on Tuesday. So think very carefully about whether you want to be in this building right now. I want to be clear about what I was doing in that moment. I was not being cruel. I was not threatening her in any legal sense. I was telling her the truth. I was informing her that her presence was known and that the situation had already moved beyond the stage where it could be resolved privately. She chose to leave. That was her choice. I said one true sentence, and she made a choice. What I find interesting when I think about it now is that I was not angry in the way I might have expected to be angry. I did not feel rage, standing in that aisle, looking at a woman sitting in my seat at my father's funeral. I felt something colder than rage, something that had more in common with clarity than with feeling. I had spent 3 weeks preparing. I had talked to my attorney. I had protected my finances. I had done the work that needed doing, quietly and methodically, while on the outside I was the grieving daughter planning her father's funeral. By the time I sat down next to her in that pew, there was nothing left to be reactive about. The situation was already handled. The whisper was just the last move in something that had already been won. People also ask about Danielle, whether I ever spoke to her, whether I blamed her. I did not speak to her after the funeral. I have no interest in doing so. Do I blame her? I think about this sometimes. She knew he was married. That much seems clear from the text messages. Whether she knew the details of my life, the funeral arrangements I was making, the waiting room at the hospital, the Sunday phone calls from my father, whether she had any understanding of the actual human cost of what she was participating in, I genuinely don't know. What I know is that the person who made vows to me was Marcus. The person who chose to bring her to my father's funeral was Marcus. The person responsible for what happened is Marcus. That is where the weight belongs, and I try to keep it there. I want to tell you about August. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was in my classroom. I go in sometimes during the summer just to think and plan because the school is empty and quiet, and I can spread things out on the desks and work without interruption. I was planning a unit on a novel I teach every fall. I had my notes spread across 3 desks, and I was reading a passage I had underlined so many times the paper was soft, when my phone rang. It was my mother. Sunday call, she said. Sunday call. I agreed. She had started calling every Sunday in June. She had not said why. She did not need to. I understood that she was filling a slot that had been emptied, doing the thing her husband had done, because she knew what it meant to receive it. We talked for an hour. She told me about the garden. I told her about the unit I was planning. At some point, she said, "Your students are lucky." Some of them would disagree, I said. "The ones who matter won't," she said. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet classroom for a while. The afternoon light came through the windows at an angle, catching the dust on the desks, the spines of the books on the shelf, the paper from my notes rustling slightly in the air conditioning. I thought about what it meant to start over. Not dramatically. Not in a way that required burning everything down and building something entirely different. Just the ordinary version of starting over, which is the version most people actually live, getting up the next morning and deciding what you're going to do with what you have left. I had my classroom, my students, my mother on Sunday afternoons, Patrice, who had driven 2 hours to stand at my elbow during my father's reception. The apartment I had moved into in July, smaller than the house, quiet and entirely mine, with a kitchen window that looked out over a courtyard where someone had planted a small garden. Not a maple tree, but something. In September, school started. I stood in front of my classroom on the first day and looked at 22 16-year-olds who had no idea what kind of year their English teacher had just come through, which is exactly as it should be. I told them we were going to read 5 books. I told them we were going to argue about those books, which was the point. I told them that literature is the technology we invented for understanding experiences we haven't had yet, and that if they paid attention, these books would teach them something useful about being alive. A boy in the third row raised his hand. "What if we don't like reading?" he said. "You will," I said. "Or you'll at least understand something better by the end. That's the deal." He looked skeptical. He was one of the best students I had that year. I thought about the funeral once more recently. It was late October. I was at my parents' house for Sunday dinner, a new habit my mother and I had started, replacing the phone call with a physical presence once a month, which is better in the ways that things in person are always better. After dinner, we went out to the backyard. The maple tree had turned. October in Ohio turns maples into something almost embarrassing in their beauty, deep orange and red and gold, the specific excess of a tree that does this once a year and does it fully. We stood under it for a while, my mother and I looking up through the branches. "He would have been 68 this year," she said. "I know," I said. "He would have called you to remind you. Several times." I laughed. "He called me twice the week of my 35th birthday. Both times to confirm I knew how old I was." She smiled. The kind of smile that has grief inside it, but isn't only grief. I looked at the tree. The leaves were coming down now, one or two at a time, spiraling in the afternoon light. My father planted this tree the day I was born. He stood at the podium of this tree's church and cried before he reached the altar. He sat on the porch beside this tree and told me Marcus would do anything for me. He was wrong about the last one, but he was right about so many other things, and the tree is still here, and so am I. I am not going to tell you that I am entirely fine. The grief comes still, in unpredictable moments. A Sunday afternoon when my phone doesn't ring. A moment in my classroom when I teach a passage about fathers and have to stop and look at the window for a few seconds before I can continue. A morning when I wake up and for a half second everything is normal, and then everything is exactly as it is. That is grief. It does not resolve on a schedule. It just slowly, over time, takes up less of the room. What I can tell you is this. The thing that I am most certain of, looking back at everything that happened in those months, is that I did not let anyone tell me how I was supposed to behave. I was supposed to fall apart at the notary's office. I did not. I was supposed to scream in that front pew. I did not. I was supposed to confront Marcus in a rage before I had protected myself. I did not. I was supposed to be the victim of the story. I refused to be. I leaned over and said one true sentence, and I straightened up, and I took out my eulogy, and I stood at a podium and honored my father the way he deserved to be honored. I did all of that in the same morning. I am proud of that. My father raised a daughter who could do that, and I am proud of him for that, and I miss him every day. The tree is in my mother's backyard. The Sunday calls continue. The classroom is full of 16-year-olds who are going to argue about books. I am still here. That is enough. That is, in fact, quite a lot. I want to tell you about the night after the funeral. Marcus had gone to bed. The house was quiet. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat at midnight writing the eulogy, the same table where I had held my coffee cup for an hour the morning after my father died, and I was not doing anything, just sitting. Patrice texted at 11:30. She had driven home after the reception, 2 hours back to Columbus. Asterisk, how are you doing? And don't say fine. Asterisk, I looked at the message for a moment. I delivered the eulogy, I wrote back. Asterisk, I sat next to her in the front pew and whispered something in her ear, and she left. Marcus said my name twice, and I didn't answer. Then I got through the rest of the day. Asterisk. 3 dots appeared. Then, asterisk, that's not fine. That's extraordinary. Asterisk, I set my phone down. The thing about Patrice, the thing that has made her my best friend since we were 19 years old, is that she does not pretend things are smaller than they are. She also does not let you pretend things are smaller than they are. She looks at the actual size of something, and she names it. She called me 2 minutes later. Tell me what happened in the pew, she said. So I told her. All of it. The moment I saw the woman sitting in my seat. The 3 seconds standing in the aisle. Walking to the pew, sitting down, leaning over. What exactly did you say? Patrice asked. I told her. Silence on the line. Then, Meg. That is the most composed thing I have ever heard of anyone doing in their life. It didn't feel composed. I said. It felt like the only thing I could do. That's what composed is, she said. It's when the only thing you can do happens to be the right thing. I sat with that. The eulogy, she said. I was watching you from the fourth pew. I want you to know that. I was watching your face the whole time. And you were magnificent, she said simply. Your father would have been beside himself. I pressed my hand over my eyes. Patrice. I know, she said. I know. We stayed on the phone for a long time that night. Not always talking. Sometimes just there, the line open, the way you stay with someone when the thing that happened is too large to process alone but also too large to discuss continuously. When I finally said goodnight, she said, whatever happens next, I'm here for all of it. You know that. I know, I said. Thank you. Don't thank me, she said. This is just what we do. I need to tell you one more thing about Marcus. About 3 months after the divorce was finalized, he called me. I almost didn't answer. I looked at his name on the screen for a long moment, and I thought about all the reasons not to answer, and then I answered because I am the kind of person who prefers to deal with things directly rather than leave them unresolved. Marcus, I said. Hi. His voice was quieter than I remembered it. Smaller, somehow. I know I don't have the right to call you. I wanted to say something that I didn't get to say. What is it? A long pause. I'm sorry about your father, he said. I know I said it at the time. I know everything I said at that point was, I know how it landed. But I want to say it now, when it's not tangled up in everything else. He was a genuinely good man. He loved you the way a father should love a daughter. And I know how much you lost. I was quiet for a moment. Thank you, I said. And I meant it. I was surprised to find that I meant it. I also want you to know, he said, that I understand what I did at the funeral. Bringing her there. What I was asking you to absorb. On that day of all days. He stopped. I don't expect you to forgive it. I'm not asking for that. I just wanted you to know that I understand it. Okay, I said. Are you? He stopped. Started again. Are you doing all right? Yes, I said. Better than all right, actually. He was quiet on the other end. I could hear him in that silence, the specific sound of someone who is taking inventory of what they have done and what it has cost and arriving at a number they were not prepared for. Good, he said finally. I'm glad. Take care of yourself, Marcus, I said. You too, he said. I hung up. I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. Outside the kitchen window of my apartment, the courtyard garden was still going. A few late fall flowers, a small ornamental tree someone had planted in the corner, its leaves mostly gone but its shape clear and sturdy against the October sky. I thought about my father saying a girl needs a tree, something that will still be here when I'm gone. I thought about the maple in my mother's backyard, enormous and rooted and completely unaffected by everything that had happened beneath it. I put my phone down. I went back to what I had been doing. There is something specific about what happened at my father's funeral that I have thought about many times since. Something beyond the obvious. My father's funeral was, by every measure, the worst day of that year. He was gone. I was standing in a church full of people who loved him, about to speak words I had written at midnight through tears, trying to do justice to a man who had never needed me to do anything for him except be his daughter. That was already more than I thought I could carry. And then there was the woman in the front pew. And the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing I find genuinely difficult to explain, is that in some way the second thing made me stronger for the first. I don't mean that in a way that sounds reasonable, because it doesn't sound reasonable. But what happened in those 3 seconds in the aisle, the clarity that arrived in me as I walked to that front pew, it did something. It sharpened something. It reminded me that I was a person with a spine, and that spine was available to me even on the worst day of my life. I stood at that podium, and I delivered that eulogy in the same state in which I had whispered one sentence in a stranger's ear. The same stillness, the same clarity, the same understanding that what I had to do was what I had to do, regardless of what else was happening around me. My father used to say, "You don't find out what you're made of in the good moments. You find out what you're made of in the other ones." He said it to me many times in various contexts, about school exams and friendship conflicts and the time I didn't make the volleyball team in 8th grade and sat in the car crying while he waited. He said it with the patience of someone who believed it completely, who had found out his own answer to that question over the course of a lifetime, and wanted me to find mine. I found mine in a front pew of St. Michael's Church. I found out that what I am made of is something that does not collapse. That grief and betrayal can exist in me simultaneously, and I can still stand up and speak. That I can whisper one sentence and then straighten up and take out a folded piece of paper and honor my father the way he deserved. He would have appreciated the practicality of it. My father was a practical man. He was not dramatic. He fixed things when they broke and went back to work and called his daughter every Sunday. He raised a daughter who, on the worst morning of her life, sat down in a pew next to a woman who had no right to be there and handled it, and then stood at a podium and made him proud. I think he would have called that a good day's work. I think he would have been right. My mother still calls on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes now, instead of calling, she comes here. She drives 40 minutes from Millbrook to my apartment in Columbus, and we drink tea in my kitchen and talk about everything and nothing, and eventually she looks out the window at the courtyard garden and says something about the light, the way it's changed, the way the seasons are moving. She brought me something last month, a small framed photograph, my father and me, at my college graduation, both of us laughing at something just out of frame. I am 22 in the photograph. He is 48. He looks exactly like himself. He looks the way I want to remember him. I put it on the kitchen shelf, where I can see it from the table. Some mornings, drinking my coffee, I look at it. Sometimes I think about what he would say if he could see everything that happened. If he could see the way it ended and the way I am now. The apartment with its kitchen window and its courtyard view. The classroom of 16-year-olds. The Sunday calls for my mother, the dinners once a month. The maple tree in the backyard in October. He would have said something practical. He would have said something that sounded simple and meant everything. He would have said, "There you are, Maggie. There you are. I am right here. I want to go back one more time to the night before." It was Sunday, 11 o'clock. Marcus had gone to bed. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet after a week of noise. The phone calls, the visitors, the constant management of logistics and grief and other people's emotions. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the eulogy in front of me. I had written it 4 times. This was the 4th draft, the one I thought I could actually deliver, and I was reading it through once more, making small adjustments, testing sentences out loud in a whisper, so I could hear what they sounded like. I got to the part about the Sunday calls. He called every Sunday afternoon, I had written, * for 12 years. Every single Sunday. Not because we scheduled it. Not because either of us had anything urgent to say. Because he wanted to. Because that is what he was, a man who showed up not when it was convenient or required, but because he simply could not imagine not doing so. * I stopped reading. I sat back in the chair, and I thought about what I knew about the next morning. The church. The front pew, the seat that would be waiting for me, and I thought, what would my father do? It is a strange thing to think, the night before you bury someone. What would this person do, in a situation they will never know about, that they could not possibly have anticipated? But I knew my father well enough to answer it, which is one of the gifts of being someone's child for 38 years. He would not have made a scene. He would not have raged. He would not have crumbled. He would have found the one clear, necessary thing to do, and he would have done it, and then he would have gotten back to the work in front of him. He was a practical man. I am his daughter. I folded the eulogy back into thirds. I turned off the kitchen light. I went upstairs and got into bed, and I lay in the dark, and I breathed, and eventually I slept. In the morning, I was ready. Something happened in my classroom in November that I want to tell you about. I was teaching a novel about a woman who loses her home, her marriage, and her sense of self over the course of 300 pages, and who builds all 3 back in a different form by the end. I have taught this novel for 6 years. I know it well. I thought I had found everything in it there was to find. I was wrong. On a Thursday afternoon, a girl in the second row, quiet, diligent, the kind of student who writes in the margins of her books and thinks carefully before she speaks, raised her hand during discussion. "I have a question," she said. "Go ahead," I said. "At the end," she said, "when she gets everything back, It's not the same things she lost. It's different things. A different house, a different relationship, a different version of herself.
She paused.
Is that still considered getting it back? Or is it something else? The room was quiet. 22 students waiting for my answer. I stood at the front of the classroom, and I thought about the question for a real moment, not a teacher moment, a real one. I think, I said slowly, it depends on what you thought you had in the first place. If what you thought you had was the specific, exact version of those things, that specific house, that specific relationship, that specific self, then no, it's not the same. You don't get those back. I paused. But if what you had was something underneath the specific version, the capacity for those things, the knowledge of how to build them, the person who built them once and can build them again, then yes. I think that's what she gets back. The girl in the second row wrote something in her margin. So, it's not about the things, she said. It's about the builder. Yes, I said. That's exactly right. I thought about that exchange for the rest of the day. On the drive home in the apartment, making dinner. I thought about it the way you think about things that land precisely, that arrive with the quality of something true. It's not about the things. It's about the builder. I had lost things this year that I will not recover in their original form. A marriage that I had believed in. A daily certainty about a person I had chosen. A father who called every Sunday and planted a tree and cried at the end of a grass aisle. Those specific things are gone. I know that. What I have is the builder. The person who planned 3 weeks ahead. Who sat in a front pew and leaned over and said one true sentence. Who stood at a podium and delivered the words she had written at midnight through tears. Who is still, every morning, getting up and deciding what to do with what she has. That person is still here. That person, I am coming to understand, is the thing I actually had all along. It is March again. 1 year since a Thursday morning at 2 a.m. when my phone rang and everything changed. I am sitting at the kitchen table in my apartment with coffee and the photograph of my father on the shelf and the window showing the courtyard garden just starting to wake up, a few early green shoots in the corner bed, the ornamental tree beginning to bud. My mother will call this afternoon. We will talk about the garden, about the maple tree, about how it looked this past winter, bare but enormous, the structure of it visible without the leaves, which she said made it look even more like itself than it did in summer. Patrice is coming to visit next weekend. We're going to cook dinner and watch a terrible movie and talk until too late, the way we have been doing since we were 19. My classroom on Monday will have 22 students in it who are in the middle of arguing about a book, passionately and with complete investment, which means I have done my job. These are the things of my life right now. Not dramatic. Not extraordinary. Just real and mine and continuing. I think about the woman in the front pew sometimes. Less than I used to. But still sometimes. I think about the 3 seconds in the aisle. The decision I made walking forward. The one sentence, delivered quietly into her ear, that turned out to be the only thing that needed to be said. I think about what it means to be composed under pressure. What it actually means in practice. Not the performed version, the version people mistake for coldness or detachment, but the real version. The version that is not the absence of feeling. The version that is feeling fully and still doing the next correct thing. My father was composed. Not cold. Composed. He cried at the end of a grass aisle, and he fixed what broke, and he called every Sunday, and he planted a tree because he understood something I am only now beginning to fully understand. That the gestures we repeat, the ones we keep returning to, are the ones that tell the truth about who we are. He called every Sunday because he was the kind of father who called every Sunday. That was not a decision he remade each week. It was just who he was. I am becoming clearer about who I am. I am the woman who sat down in that pew, who whispered one sentence and straightened up and took out a folded piece of paper and stood at a podium, who spent 3 weeks preparing before she said a single word to her husband, who protected what needed protecting and then, when it was time, ended what needed to end. That is who I am. It is enough. It is actually quite a lot. The coffee is getting cold. The courtyard outside is gray and early and full of the specific potential of a March morning that hasn't decided yet what it's going to be. I am going to drink my coffee. I am going to call my mother. I am going to get ready for the week. My father's photograph is on the shelf. The tree is in the backyard. I am still here.